The first hard freeze hit the Dakota Territory on the 23rd of October, 1878, and by noon that day, every man in the settlement of Grover Crossing had already burned through more firewood than he'd planned to use in a full week. Wind hammered the prairie from the northwest at a steady 30 miles an hour, driving snow sideways through gaps that hadn't mattered in September. 14 families huddled behind sod walls and green lumber sheathing and prayed their stacks would last until March. They would not. Most of them knew it before supper. But out at the eastern edge of the claim land, where a widow named Marta Holacek had filed her 160 acres 16 months prior, something was different. The men who rode past her place that evening, on their way to borrow cordwood from the Svensson brothers because pride only stretches so far when your children are cold, noticed that her stovepipe was barely smoking. Not gone cold, not out, just barely. Like a woman cooking a slow pot of something she didn't need to rush. They noticed it, and they said nothing, and they kept riding because Marta Holacek was the kind of woman who made people uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite articulate. She was 61 years old that winter. She had come to Dakota Territory from Moravia, in the eastern part of what was then the Austrian Empire, 22 years after her husband Andrei had preceded her to the grave with a logging accident that left her with 2 grown sons, 12 acres of debt, and a mind sharpened by decades of watching other people's plans fall apart. Her sons were in Minnesota. She had chosen not to follow them. She had chosen, instead, 160 acres of high-grass prairie in the James River Valley, a government homestead claim and a plan that nobody at the land office or the general store or the Lutheran church in Grover Crossing could quite make sense of. She had spent her first summer on the claim not building a house. She had built a barn. It was a good barn, better than most of the barns in the settlement actually, which caused its own small friction. 16 feet wide, 32 feet long, post and beam construction with a mortise and tenon frame that she and a hired carpenter named Alphonse Brandt had assembled over 6 weeks in the summer of 1877. The siding was rough-sawn cottonwood, which wasn't ideal, but it was what the mill in Aberdeen had available at a price she could manage. The roof was sound. There was a hayloft above and stalls for 4 animals below, and the whole structure sat with its long axis running east to west, its back turned hard to the north wind. None of this was remarkable. What was remarkable, what got people talking, was what she built inside it. In the fall of 1877, after the frame was up and the roof was on, but before she'd finished the siding, Marta Holacek hired Alphonse Brandt back for 3 more weeks and had him build a room. Not a tack room, not a feed room. A room, 8 feet by 12 feet in the southeast corner of the barn, with its own door and its own small window and walls that Alphonse framed with double studs 16 inches apart, leaving a 4-inch cavity between the inner and outer wall faces. She filled that cavity herself, over the course of 4 November afternoons, with dry prairie grass packed so dense it barely moved when you pressed a finger into it. The ceiling was the same, a double layer of boards with 6 inches of packed grass between them. The floor she left as dirt, but she tamped it down hard and then covered it with a layer of flat limestone she'd hauled up from the riverbank in a wagon, 14 trips over 2 weeks, roughly 300 pounds of stone. Then she moved into the barn. She did not have a house yet. She had a claim shack, a 12 by 14 structure of single wall boards that she'd thrown up the previous August to satisfy the residency requirement, but she slept and cooked and lived in the barn room all through the winter of 1877 to 1878, her first winter on the claim, and that winter was not a hard one by Dakota standards. The cold came and went. She had time to observe. What she observed, she did not share freely. She was not a woman who explained herself to people who hadn't asked good questions. The Reverend Theodore Huss, who served the Lutheran congregation in Grover Crossing and made pastoral calls on the homesteaders every few weeks throughout the settling season, came by in late November of 1877 and found her in her barn room, sitting at a small table she'd made from a packing crate, reading a letter from her son in Minnesota by the light of a tallow candle. She had a small cast iron stove in the corner, a number 7 parlor stove, not a cook stove, maybe 90 pounds of iron, and it was barely warm to the touch. The Reverend Haas noted later, in the letter he wrote to his sister in Iowa, that the room itself was surprisingly comfortable. He had expected cold. He found instead a close, dry warmth that reminded him of his grandmother's kitchen in Baden-Württemberg. He asked Marta how she was managing the fuel. She told him she was burning about 4 pounds of wood per hour on bad days, maybe 2 pounds on middling days. He didn't know what to make of that number. He filed it away and wrote on. 4 pounds per hour was less than half what his own stove burned to heat a space half that size. By spring of 1878, Marta had taken careful notes in a small ledger she kept in check, which meant no one in Grover Crossing was going to read it without her permission. She had burned a total of 8 cords of wood between the 1st of November and the 1st of April. 5 months of Dakota winter, including 3 genuine cold snaps where temperatures dropped to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. A typical homesteader in the valley burned between 3 and 4 cords over the same period. Ezra Tamblin, who had a better-built sod house than most and was considered something of an expert on winter economy, had burned 2.4 cords. He was proud of that number. He mentioned it at every opportunity. Marta said nothing. She started building her house. The house she built that summer was not inside the barn. This confused people, because they had assumed the barnroom arrangement was her permanent solution, and they had been prepared to mock it for years. Instead, she positioned her house 30 feet to the south of the barn, connected to it by a covered passage, a roofed breezeway with open sides 8 feet long that she could walk through without going outside. The house itself was small, 16 by 20 feet, and it was built with the same double wall technique she'd used in the barnroom, only improved. The wall cavity was now 6 inches wide. She filled it not with loose grass but with bundles, tight cylinders of twisted prairie hay, each about 4 inches in diameter, packed horizontally into the cavity and tamped firm. The bundles were denser than loose fill, and they didn't settle the same way. She'd spent the winter thinking about that problem. The roof was her most ambitious piece of work. Flat-roofed sod construction was common in the valley, and it had real advantages. The earth provided insulation and weight, and it didn't need much lumber. But sod roofs leaked in spring thaw, and they were heavy enough to collapse under a bad snow load. Marta had a pitched roof which required more lumber, but she built it with a double structure. An inner ceiling of boards, then 12 inches of space filled with dry prairie grass, then the outer roof boards and tar paper. The total roof insulation package was nearly 3 times what any other settler in Grover Crossing had attempted. Alphonse Brandt, who built it with her, told his wife he'd never seen anything like it. He also told his wife the old Czech woman was peculiar in ways he couldn't quite name, but that made him feel like he was always slightly behind in a conversation. She was peculiar in this way. She measured things. She measured her wood supply obsessively, marking her stack every week with a notched stick. She measured the outdoor temperature using a small mercury thermometer she'd paid $2.30 for in Aberdeen. She measured the indoor temperature the same way, and she wrote both numbers down every morning and every evening in her check ledger. She had been doing this since the first winter in Moravia that she could remember clearly, which was the winter of 1839, when she was 22 years old, and her mother's house in the village of Bošević had burned 4 cords of beechwood between November and March, and they'd still been cold for the last 2 weeks of February when the wood ran out. She had decided that winter that she would never again be without a precise and honest account of her fuel consumption versus her heat production. It had taken her 4 decades and an ocean crossing to build the system she actually wanted, but she'd been working on the problem that whole time. The double wall construction was not her invention. She knew that. Scandinavian builders had used similar techniques for generations in Norway and Sweden, where the winters were long and fuel was precious. German craftsmen in Bavaria had their own version, using plaster-filled cavities for both insulation and fire resistance. In the mountains of Moravia, the older farmhouses sometimes had their main living quarters built inside the barn structure itself. Not accidentally, not from poverty, but deliberately, because the body heat of the animals and the insulating mass of the surrounding hay and timber and earthen floor created a thermal buffer that could cut firewood consumption by 40 to 60% compared to a freestanding house. Marta had grown up in one of those houses. She had not forgotten it. What she had done, here on the Dakota prairie where there were no mountains and no thick forest and no generations of accumulated craft knowledge, was figure out how to replicate the principle using the materials available. Prairie grass was not hay bales, but she had tested it for a full winter and her numbers were good. If you want to know more about how frontier settlers solved problems that modern engineers are still discovering, subscribe to this channel. We're preserving these techniques not as museum pieces but as living knowledge, the kind that still works when everything else fails. Join the community of people who believe this history is worth keeping. Now, the neighbors who had laughed. There were 4 of them who had been most vocal, and they were not foolish men. That's worth saying. They had legitimate reasons for their skepticism, and they expressed it in the way of the frontier. Not cruelly, exactly, but with the particular confidence of people who had survived hard seasons and thought they understood the variables. The first was Halvard Lund, who had come from Telemark in Norway 12 years prior and had homesteaded in Minnesota before moving to Dakota for cheaper land. He was 44, broad-shouldered, weathered to the color of old oak, and he knew cold the way a sailor knows water. He'd built his claim house with sod walls 2 feet thick and a sod roof, and it performed well. His objection to Marta's approach was practical and specific. He had seen grass-filled walls before, in old Norwegian construction, and his experience was that they settled and compressed over the first 2 winters until the insulation value was half what it had started at. "She'll be burning twice the wood by her 3rd year," he said to Alphonse Brandt in November of 1878, standing in the doorway of the general store while the first real blizzard of the season was building on the northwest horizon. "The grass settles. Always does. Ask any man from the old country." He wasn't wrong about the settling, he just didn't know about the bundles. The second skeptic was a former Union Army quartermaster sergeant named Cornelius Fitch, who had come to Dakota in 1874 with a veteran's land grant and a quartermaster's instinct for supply logistics. He was 52, lean and precise, with a habit of calculating things in his head and presenting his conclusions as though they'd been reviewed by a committee. His concern was different from Halvard's. He'd looked at Marta's firewood stack in September, before the cold came, and he'd calculated that she had approximately 1.1 cords of split hardwood and maybe another 0.4 cords of cottonwood and willow. His arithmetic said that was not enough for a Dakota winter by any reasonable standard, regardless of insulation claims. "I've wintered here 4 years, he told the Reverend Haas in October. 2 cords minimum for a well-built structure. She has half that. By January, she'll be burning her furniture." He said it without malice. He was doing the math, honestly. His math was right. His inputs were wrong. The third was a woman, which is worth noting because the historians who write about frontier skepticism tend to forget that women had opinions and expressed them. Her name was Agnieszka Walczak, and she had come from the Poznan region of Prussia with her husband Stefan and their 4 children in 1875. She was 38, sharp-faced and direct, with a Prussian farmer's contempt for what she considered impractical cleverness. Her objection to Marta's setup was aesthetic and social as much as technical. "A woman sleeping in a barn," she said to her neighbor Ingrid Svensson in September. "In Moravia, maybe that's normal. Here we are trying to build something better." She paused and added, with the precision of someone who had thought about it, "And a grass-filled wall will hold mice." "I've seen it. You'll have mice in your walls all winter, and they'll eat your insulation down to nothing before March." This was also a real concern. Marta had thought of it too. The 4th skeptic was the most credentialed, and in some ways the most interesting. His name was Douglas Crane, and he had come to Dakota Territory in 1872 as a surveyor's assistant and had stayed to file his own claim when the work dried up. He was 36, formally educated at a small Ohio college, and he had read more books about agriculture and construction than anyone else in Grover Crossing. He subscribed to the Prairie Farmer and the Rural New Yorker, and he had opinions about scientific farming that he expressed at length whenever given an opportunity. His objection to Marta's construction was theoretical. "The thermal mathematics don't support her claimed reduction," he told anyone who would listen in the autumn of 1878. "An insulated wall reduces heat loss proportionally to the temperature differential. Her interior to exterior differential is the same as everyone else's. Therefore, her savings should be proportional to her insulation improvement, not the dramatic difference she seems to be claiming." He pulled numbers from somewhere, maybe the Rural New Yorker, maybe his own reasoning, and concluded she should be burning perhaps 15% less wood than average, not 60% less. "If she's claiming 60%, he said, "she's either measuring wrong or lying." He did not think she was lying. He thought she was measuring wrong. He was the one Marta eventually talked to. Not because she liked him especially, she didn't dislike him, but she found his manner of expressing certainty slightly exhausting. But because he was the one who asked the right question. He came to her place in early December of 1878, ostensibly to check on her welfare, but actually, she understood, because his own curiosity had gotten the better of his skepticism. He stood in her barn room. She was living there again for the winter while she finished some work on the house interior, and he looked at the stove and he looked at the wall construction, and he said, "Where does the heat go? Not where does it come from? Where does it go?" She liked that question. She showed him the ledger. He stood at her small table for 20 minutes, reading numbers he couldn't understand linguistically, but could follow mathematically, because Marta's notation system was consistent and the temperature columns were obvious and the wood consumption tallies were in pounds written in Arabic numerals. He looked at the previous winter's data, 1877 to 1878, her first full season in the insulated barn room. He looked at the outdoor temperatures she'd recorded, and he looked at the corresponding wood consumption. And then he went quiet, in a way that Halvard Lund, who did not go to college, would have recognized immediately as the quiet of a man revising a strongly held position. "The differential savings are compounding," he said finally. He said it to himself more than to her. She waited. "It's not just the walls," he said. "The barn structure itself is acting as a windbreak and a second thermal envelope. The heat your animals generate. How many animals do you have in here?" "2 cows and a mule," she said. He did some arithmetic in his head. 2 dairy cows produce roughly 1,500 BTUs per hour each in body heat, and a working mule about 2,000. That's 5,000 BTUs per hour of free heat being generated in the space surrounding her insulated room, holding the ambient temperature of the barn itself somewhere between 15 and 25 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the outside air, which then meant the temperature differential her insulated walls had to manage was 15 to 25 degrees less than it would be for a freestanding structure. Apply that to her 6-inch grass bundle walls, which he'd told him had an insulating value roughly equivalent to a modern engineer's R14, and the math started to produce numbers that matched her ledger. "This isn't one insulation system," he said. "It's 3, nested." She looked at him the way a teacher looks at a student who has finally done the reading. He left an hour later and rode the 2 miles back to his own claim house. Single-wall lumber, no insulation, decent sod roof, and sat in his kitchen with a cup of coffee and thought about the winter of 1876, when he'd run out of fuel in February and spent 3 weeks burning fence posts and the pine shelving from his pantry. He thought about the winter of 1877, when he'd been more careful and still come close. He thought about the two cords he had stacked behind his house right now, and the fact that he was already burning faster than he'd planned, because October had started early and mean and November looked like more of the same. He went back to Marta's place 3 days later with a question and a proposal. The question was about her firewood stack. She had shown him in the ledger that she planned to use approximately 1 cord total for the entire winter. She had 5 cords on hand, which she considered a 33% safety margin over her projected consumption. He wanted to know where she stored it. She took him to a lean-to shed attached to the south wall of the barn. It was a simple structure. 3 walls, a roof, open to the south, about 12 feet wide and 8 feet deep. The firewood was stacked inside it, split and ranked and absolutely dry. Not the usual dry, where the outer splits have shed their moisture, but the inner ones still hold dampness that steals heat when you burn them. Bone dry. The kind of dry that produces a clean, sharp crack when you split a piece. Not the dull thud of wood that still has water in it. He'd been burning wet cottonwood all November. The difference in heat output between dry hardwood and wet cottonwood was, depending on species and moisture content, somewhere between 40 and 70%. He was burning wood that was working at maybe 60% of its potential heat production. "How long has it been drying?" he asked. "Since April," she said. "I cut it in March." He was burning wood he'd cut in September. He knew in the abstract that wood needed to dry before it burned well. He had not quite reckoned with the practical difference between knowing that and actually implementing it. The proposal he brought her was simple. He wanted to build a covered wood storage shed on his own property before the next season. He was willing to pay her, or to do labor for her, or to trade whatever she needed, in exchange for her telling him precisely how she'd built her lean-to and organized her cutting schedule. He said this awkwardly because he was a proud man, and asking for help from a woman he doubted was not something that came naturally. She received it without drama. She told him to come by on Saturday and she'd walk him through it. That was December 8, 1878. By December 15th, Douglas Crane had told Halvard Lund and Cornelius Fitch and his nearest neighbor, a young man named Petrus Jacobs, who had come from the Cape Colony in South Africa and was on his second Dakota winter and already behind on his fuel budget. All four of them came to Marta's place on Saturday the 14th, which was a cold, bright morning with the temperature sitting at -7 degrees Fahrenheit and a thin, hard wind out of the northwest. Agnieszka Walczak came too, though she hadn't been invited, because Ingrid Svensson had told her about the gathering, and Agnieszka was a woman who made it a policy to know things. This is the point where I want to ask you something. If you've learned anything from this story already, about the way one person's careful preparation can hold a community together when a hard winter comes, then hit the like button. It tells us these stories matter to you, and if you're new here, take a moment to subscribe. We're building a library of forgotten frontier knowledge, and every subscriber helps us keep making it. Marta showed them all of it. She did not hold back, which some of her neighbors had half expected she would. She showed them the barn room with its double walls and the thermometer and the ledger. She showed them the lean-to wood storage and explained her system. She cut her wood in late February and early March when the snow was still on the ground, but the worst cold had passed and the days were getting longer. She split it immediately, green wood splits cleaner than dry, and stacked it in the covered lean-to with 6-inch gaps between the rows to allow air circulation. By the following November, it had been drying for 8 or 9 months, and it was as good as any hardwood you could buy from a commercial dealer in a city. The lean-to's open south face meant it got maximum sun exposure in winter and good air movement in summer. The roof overhang kept rain and snow off the top rows. The simple physics of it were not complicated once you saw them. She showed them the covered passage between barn and house, and she explained why it mattered. When you opened an exterior door in a Dakota winter, you lost heat, not gradually, catastrophically. A door standing open for 30 seconds in -20 weather could undo an hour of careful heating. The covered passage meant she never opened a true exterior door between the barn and the house. She went from one heated or semi-heated space to another, always. Every trip to tend her animals or collect eggs or check her wood supply cost her maybe a third of what it would have cost without the passage. Halvard Lund stood at the entrance to the lean-to and looked at the firewood for a long time without speaking. He was a man who understood wood. He could tell, just by looking at it, that this wood was properly seasoned. The ends of the splits had the characteristic radial cracking of wood that had dried slowly and thoroughly. The bark was loose on most of the pieces. The color was right, not the pale cream of fresh-cut wood, not the gray-black of punky rotting wood, but the warm tan of properly cured timber. He pulled a piece out, a split of box elder about 18 inches long, and hefted it. It was noticeably lighter than fresh wood of the same size would have been. He put it back and looked at Marta. "The bundles," he said. "The grass bundles in the wall. They don't settle?" She told him no, they didn't. The key was the diameter. Tight bundles 4 inches across, packed horizontally so the grass stems were running parallel to the wall face, not perpendicular. Perpendicular packing created channels that air could move through and that would compress under gravity. Horizontal packing created a matrix that was stable because the bundles were supporting each other laterally. She had figured this out by making 2 test wall sections in the spring of 1877, one with each packing method, and leaving them for 6 months before she checked. The horizontal bundle wall had settled less than half an inch. The loose grass wall had settled 4 inches out of 12. Halvard said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "My grandfather built like this, in Telemark. I forgot." Cornelius Fitch wanted to know about the mice. He had heard Agnieszka's concern. Word traveled in a small settlement, and he had his own memories of mice colonizing a haystack he'd stored improperly in Minnesota, reducing it to a network of tunnels and droppings within a single winter. Marta showed him the wire. She had lined the lower 2 feet of the wall cavity on the exterior face with 1/4-inch hardware cloth, a wire mesh she'd ordered from Aberdeen the previous spring. The mice couldn't get through 1/4-inch mesh. The insulation above 2 feet was safe because mice don't climb inside walls. They enter at the base. She'd also laid a border of limestone slabs around the exterior base of the wall, buried 6 inches into the ground, which discouraged burrowing approaches. In 2 winters of occupation, she had found exactly 4 mouse carcasses in her traps inside the living space, all in the first month of the first winter before she'd finished sealing the entry points, and 0 since. Agnieszka Walczak was quiet through all of this. She was a proud woman, but she was also a practical one. And the evidence in front of her, the ledger, the wood stack, the thermometer reading that showed the barn room at 61 degrees Fahrenheit with the stove barely ticking over, was not something she could argue with. She asked one question that no one else had asked. In winter, she said, when the cold comes fast, what is the worst night you have had? The temperature. How low? Marta went to the ledger and found the entry. January 19, 1878. Outdoor temperature, minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit. The stove had been burning at moderate output. She'd stoked it before bed, and it had run down to coals by 2 in the morning when she'd gotten up to add wood. The indoor temperature at 2 in the morning before she stoked it, 43 degrees Fahrenheit. She'd added 4 pounds of wood, and by 6 in the morning it was back to 62. A difference of 74 degrees between inside and outside, maintained with 4 pounds of wood overnight. In a space of 8 by 12 feet, the barn providing its buffer, the double walls holding their ground, the dry cured box elder burning clean and hot. Agnieszka looked at that ledger entry for 10 seconds. Then she looked at her husband Stefan, who had come along and was standing at the back of the small group. He met her eyes. Something passed between them that was not a spoken conversation but was nonetheless complete. They had burned through their fuel reserve twice already in 3 Dakota winters. They had been cold in their house in ways that were not merely uncomfortable but frightening, the kind of cold that settles into your bones in November and doesn't fully leave until May. They had 4 children, the youngest not yet 3 years old. "Will you teach us?" Agnieszka asked. Marta said she would. What followed that winter and the next spring was not a formal school or a planned exchange. It was more organic than that, and more Dakota, people coming by with questions, Marta answering them in the direct and slightly impatient way she had, then watching to see if they'd actually done what she'd told them. Douglas Crane built his covered wood shed in March of 1879 and began cutting and splitting his fuel supply 2 months earlier than he ever had before. Halvard Lund rebuilt one wall of his claim house with double framing and horizontal grass bundles, leaving the other 3 walls as they were so he could compare the temperatures. By the following winter, he had rebuilt all 4 walls and added a covered passage from his house to his barn. Cornelius Fitch applied his quartermaster's methodical nature to an obsessive documentation project, measuring heat loss and fuel consumption across 7 different homesteads in the valley and producing a handwritten report that he shared with the land office in Aberdeen, and that eventually, by a long and improbable chain of copying and correspondence, reached a professor at the University of Minnesota Agricultural Experiment Station in 1882. The professor's name was Eli Blackwood, and he was at that time trying to solve one of the central problems of Northern Plains homesteading: the chronic fuel crisis that was causing settler abandonment rates on the Dakota and Minnesota prairies to run 20 to 30% higher than in more wooded territories. Settlers were leaving not because the land was bad, the land was extraordinary, but because they couldn't stay warm. Trees were scarce on the open prairie, coal was expensive and unreliably available, and the single-wall construction methods that most settlers brought from more temperate regions were simply not adequate to winters that could run -30 for 3 consecutive weeks. He corresponded with Cornelius Fitch, who referred him to Marta's ledger. He wrote to Marta directly, in formal English, that must have been amusing in contrast to the directness she preferred. She wrote back in her careful second-language English, 4 pages of precise description that included her wall construction specifications, her wood storage protocols, her cutting schedule, and her temperature and consumption data going back to the winter of 1877. She also included, in passing, a note that the same principles of nested thermal envelopes had been used in the mountain farm buildings of Moravia for at least 2 centuries, as far as she knew, and that perhaps that information would be of interest. It was. Professor Blackwood incorporated Marta's system, with full attribution to his credit, which was not universally common in the academic practices of the 1880s. into a bulletin on Northern Plains construction that the Agricultural Experiment Station published in 1884. The bulletin recommended insulated wall cavities of not less than 4 inches for structures intended as year-round dwellings in the Northern Territories, covered wood storage as a standard practice rather than an optional improvement, and the use of animal housing as a thermal buffer where livestock numbers permitted. It went through 3 printings between 1884 and 1891 and was distributed to land offices across the Dakotas, Minnesota, Nebraska, and Kansas. The specific technique of horizontal grass bundle packing, with its superior stability compared to loose fill, was described in detail in the bulletin's appendix, with a footnote that traced it to an experienced settler in the James River Valley, Dakota Territory, who had adapted similar techniques from Central European vernacular building practice. Marta Holicek died in the winter of 1893 in her house in Grover Crossing, Dakota Territory, which was by then South Dakota, having achieved statehood in 1889. She was 76 years old. She died in late February, which was the hard part of the winter, and by all accounts, she died warm. Her house was occupied afterward by the youngest son of Agnieszka and Stefan Walczak, who had learned the construction principles from his parents and had maintained and improved the property in the years after Marta's decline. He lived there until 1931. The barn still stood in 1931. The wall insulation Alphonse Brandt had packed in 1877, 54 years prior, had settled over the decades, perhaps 2 inches in 12. The mice had gotten into one section in the 1910s, after the hardware cloth had corroded and not been replaced promptly, and had done some damage that was repaired with new bundles and fresh wire. But the fundamental structure held, and the fundamental principle held, and the people in that settlement of the James River Valley knew something about staying warm through a Dakota winter that many of their neighbors in other parts of the territory were still learning the hard way. Douglas Crane, who became a county commissioner and something of a public figure in the region in the 1890s, gave a speech at the South Dakota Agricultural Society in the autumn of 1896 that was reported in the Huron Plainsman. He spoke about the fuel crisis of the 1870s and 1880s and the techniques that had helped settlers survive it. He mentioned Professor Blackwood's bulletin. He mentioned the experimental work at the Minnesota station. And then he paused and he said something that the Plainsman reporter put in the paper verbatim, because it struck him as the kind of thing that deserved to be recorded precisely. The woman who first showed us these principles was a 60-year-old widow from Moravia who had come to Dakota Territory with less money than most of us spent on a season's supply of lamp oil. She had not attended any institution of learning beyond the village school. She had never read an American agricultural bulletin in her life. What she had done was pay close attention, for 40 years, to the relationship between cold and heat and wood and walls. She had kept records. And when the cold came, the real cold, the Dakota cold that wants to kill you, she was ready. We were not. We are now. This was true. They were by then ready. The settlement that had laughed at the old woman sleeping in her barn had become one of the lowest fuel consumption communities in the James River Valley, with average winter wood use running roughly 40% below regional norms by the mid-1880s. Halvard Lund never ran short of fuel again after he rebuilt his walls. Cornelius Fitch became such a thorough practitioner of insulated construction that he eventually built a secondary insulated room inside his main house, a room within a room, as he described it in a letter to his brother in Wisconsin, that he used as a sick room during the typhoid outbreak of 1886. Where the constant warmth aided recovery in ways the limited medicine of the time could not. Agnieszka Walczak taught her daughters the bundle packing technique, and her daughters taught their daughters, and the knowledge moved down the line in a way that formal agricultural education was only beginning to attempt from the top down. If you've stayed with this story all the way to this point, and I hope you have, because this is the part where it all comes together, then you understand what made Marta Holicek's approach different. It wasn't that she was smarter than her neighbors. Halvard Lund was a gifted builder. Cornelius Fitch was a precise and careful thinker. Douglas Crane had read more books than anyone in the settlement. What Marta had was not intelligence in the abstract. She had a specific disciplined practice of observation and record-keeping that she had maintained for 4 decades, and she had the patience to let the evidence she'd gathered outweigh the opinions of people who were improvising under pressure. The second subscribed CTA belongs here, because this is exactly why this channel exists. the knowledge that Marta Holchek carried in her check ledger, the kind that lives in practice and measurement, and the accumulated experience of people who had no margin for error. That knowledge has a way of disappearing when the people who hold it are gone. Subscribe to this channel and help us keep it. Not because we're asking for support, but because this is a library that only gets built if people believe it's worth building. Join the others who have already decided it is. There is a detail about the barn room that Douglas Crane's Huron plainsman speech did not mention because he may not have known it, or because it seemed too small a thing for a county commissioner's address. It was this. Marta Holchek, in her first winter on the Dakota claim, had not only moved into the barn room for warmth. She had moved into the barn room so that she could hear her animals. She had 2 cows and a mule and a small flock of chickens, and she was 60 years old and alone on 160 acres of open prairie, 43 miles from the nearest town, in the first winter of her homesteading life. She moved into the barn room so she would know immediately if something went wrong with them. If a cow went down in the night, she'd hear it. If something came for the chickens, she'd hear it. If the temperature dropped faster than she'd expected and she needed to add more fuel, she'd know, because the animals would tell her with their sounds, their movements, the particular quality of their breathing in deep cold. She was, in other words, not simply solving an engineering problem. She was solving a problem of attention, the problem of being one person in a big cold space, responsible for other living things, without the luxury of ignorance. The insulation kept her warm, the animals kept her from being alone, the ledger kept her honest. And the combination of all three kept her alive and intact through 5 Dakota winters until she was old enough to have proved her system and young enough still to teach it. The frontier does not forgive inattention. That was the lesson every settler learned sooner or later at whatever cost the prairie decided to charge. What Marta Holchek understood, and what the men who laughed at her had not yet learned, was that survival was not a matter of strength or even knowledge in the abstract. It was a matter of systems. You built the wall so the heat stayed in. You stored the wood so it would burn clean. You lived close to your animals so you knew what was happening. And you kept your records so that next year you would know exactly where you stood, and the year after that, and every year that followed, until the knowledge was so deep in your bones that the cold couldn't find a gap to come through. The winters that broke the unprepared settlers of the James River Valley in the late 1870s and 1880s, and they were real. They were killing winters, the kind of cold that stopped the heart if you were caught out, that froze wells and cracked iron and turned livestock into statues in the night. Those winters came and went, and Marta's house stood, and her wood stack never ran out, and the thermometer in her room never dropped below 43 degrees even at -31 outside. Not because she was lucky, not because she was exceptional in the way we usually mean that word, because she had thought carefully about the problem, built for what she knew was coming, and measured every piece of the solution until the solution was certain. You can still build a room within a room. You can still stack your wood properly and cut it 8 months before you need it. You can still think about the nested envelopes of heat, the barn around the room around the stove, and understand why each layer makes the next one cheaper. The physics haven't changed. The Dakota winter hasn't changed, for that matter, though the people in its path have access to things Marta didn't. What we have that she didn't is the choice to learn before the cold comes, rather than during. That's the last thought I'll leave you with. Marta Holchek made her preparations in April and May and June, when the weather was warm and the work was easy and the neighbors thought she was peculiar. She didn't wait for the crisis. She built for it. And when the crisis came, and it always comes, on the frontier or off it, in whatever form your particular latitude and longitude deliver, she was sitting in a 60-degree room with a barely burning stove and a ledger that said, in plain numbers, exactly how much longer she could hold. If that's the kind of story you want to keep hearing, the stories of people who prepared when it was hard and held when it was harder, and left knowledge behind when they were gone, then subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next one, and share this video with someone who still believes in the old ways. This knowledge belongs to all of us, and it only survives if we carry it forward.